Hey, shalom, shalom, shalom. First and foremost, call hello, Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Rekal Pradash. Once again, double honors go out to the apostles, bishops, and elders. Great millstone, who rule well and deserve double honors. Salutations also go out to the fellow Akim out there on the highways and byways, pushing this truth across the four corners, waking up the remaining hopefully elect. Because as prophecy is proven, time is very short. Alright? So here in this video, as you can probably read by now, we're going to talk about the bombings, the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Alright? Which did not need to happen. And this was something that, well, these weapons were built, so of course, in using them, it served the purpose of what? Inspiring shock and awe to the rest of the world. Alright? And which of course started the arms race. Alright? But again, did this need to happen? Short answer, of course, is no, but he's going to go into detail as to what really happened here. So let's go ahead and roll this. Oh, before I start, remember, these facts are coming out, of course, to the dislike of many, as you can imagine. But let's just go ahead and this is Ecclesiastes 12 and 14, and I will use this regularly on videos like this because the truth is coming out. Alright, we're here at the end. Alright, so again, this devil is being exposed for who and what he is. Alright, they are the wicked, indeed. This is Ecclesiastes 12 and 14. For the Most High shall bring every work into judgment, with every secret thing. Let me see, because I like to, so you can read it also. Let's see. Alright, for the Most High shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. Alright, let's get another one. Let's go to Luke 12 and verse 2. It says, for there is nothing covered that shall not be revealed, neither hid that shall not be known. All these documents you see that are heavily redacted or that have this cap on them, you know, well, we'll release them 50 years from now, some shit like that. Alright. Whatever. Alright. You're being found out, you damn devil, for the piece of shit that you really are. So let's go ahead and roll this.
It's very common for Western governments and media outlets to tell the rest of the world it should be very afraid of North Korea and its nuclear weapons, or to warn everyone that Iran could one day soon have nukes.
Yeah.
But the reality is that there is only one country in human history that has used nuclear weapons against a civilian population.
How about that?
And not once, but twice. And that, of course, was the United States. On the 6th and 9th of August, 1945, the U.S. military dropped nuclear bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Around 200,000 Japanese civilians were killed in this nuclear attack. Now, still today, nearly 80 years later, it is still very common to hear officials in the United States and teachers in the U.S. education system claim that the U.S. military had to nuke Japan in order to end World War II. I studied in the United States as a child. I went to public school, and my teachers over many years told me this. However, it is false. If you do very basic study, if you read the history of World War II, you can find that in reality, it was not necessary for the United States to bomb Japan with these nuclear bombs that killed 200,000 people. This was a political decision taken by the United States aimed at the Soviet Union. This was the first act of the Cold War. And the reality was that the Soviet Union was on the verge of liberating Japan, of overthrowing the Japanese fascist regime that had been allied with Nazi Germany. And the United States was afraid that if the Soviets defeated Japanese fascism, then Japan, the post-fascist government in Japan, it would be created later on, would become an ally of the Soviet Union and would go so.
Instead of, as it stands now and has been, the United States. Or the United Snakes, as I used to call them. You see, that ulterior motive and all this propagandist bullshit that we were taught in schools.
Socialist. And of course, right immediately at the end of World War II, the U.S. launched the Cold War against the Soviet Union and against socialism all around the world. Now, this might sound like a controversial opinion, but it's not an opinion. It's actually a documented fact that we can see reflected in U.S. government documents and many mainstream historians in the United States at top universities have written about this history. This is the real history of the U.S. nuclear bombing of Japan. It was a political decision, and today I'm going to look through the evidence, including from the U.S. government itself, the U.S. Department of War, which at that time that's what it was called. Today it's known as the Department of Defense, the Pentagon. It changed its name in the 1940s after World War II. The U.S. Department of War published a strategic bombing survey in 1946 that reviewed the impact of the U.S. bombing in World War II.
I'm going to pull up something right now because it was something, he didn't mention it, but let's see. Nagasaki was not the original. Okay. Let's see. So evidently other people. Okay, Nagasaki wasn't actually the primary target for, okay, hold on. It says the United States used the first and thus far only atomic weapons in warfare in August 1945. On August 6th, a bomb fell on Hiroshima, Japan, killing 80,000 people instantly. This was followed by an attack on Nagasaki on August 9th, with 40,000 killed. Radiation with poison would kill over 200,000 more in the aftermath, okay? Today, debate continues over the decisions to use the bomb. On the one hand, it was thought a demonstration of such power would end the war immediately, save millions of Allied lives, like we were talking about, you know. That's what we were all taught in school, but we're learning that was bullshit. All right? Let's see. Hold on. I'm going to get to the point. Target. Here it is. Kokura was initially. In the dark of the morning on August 9th, the B-29 bomber Backscar took off from Tinian Island in the Pacific carrying a nuke named Fat Boy. All right, it headed for the city of Kokura, northeast of Nagasaki, on the opposite side of their Japanese island. Kokura was the primary target due to its large military arsenal. When the B-29 arrived, it had a problem. The bomb could only be targeted by sight, and due to cloud cover, Kokura was not visible. The bomber circled in the air 3 times before the crew commander ruled they would head for the secondary target, Nagasaki. So there you have it. All right. Continuing on.
War II. And that U.S. government document admitted that the U.S. nuclear bombing of Japan was not necessary to end the war. Japan was already going to surrender by the end of 1945. Instead, the U.S. bombing again was aimed at the Soviet Union. But before that, I want to also briefly look at comments that were made by the U.S. president who succeeded the president who dropped.
What did I say about shock and awe? You see what we did to these yellow bastards here? You commie bastards. That's all it was.
The atomic bombs. So, of course, the president who nuked Japan was was?
George Carlin, the comedian, made a good point in his stand-up. He said, well, why didn't they do this to Germany? Because those are white people. Think about it. So they use these to demonstrate to other white folks, you better get in line.
Harry Truman. But his successor, Dwight Eisenhower, was a top U.S. military general, and Eisenhower also oversaw the U.S. military's operations in Germany and France in World War II. And it's not that well known that in reality, Eisenhower...
Who? Eisenhower? You know, everybody likes Ike, as it was told, but he killed, and Germans to this day, all right, another reason to hate the United States, with the stroke of a pen, Eisenhower killed 1 million of them, all right, because how the Geneva Convention was worded, all right, and a lot of them, because of what Ike did in these camps where they were held prisoner, as prisoners of war, a lot of them died from diseases and stuff. You can look it up.
Eisenhower wrote a memoir in 1963 in which he criticized the U.S. nuking of Japan, and he admitted that it was not necessary for the U.S. to drop the atomic bomb.
So far you got two sources here.
Now, this history is also important to correct because Hollywood released the blockbuster film Oppenheimer this July 2023, and this was directed by Christopher Nolan. It was a huge success. And there has been some criticism of the film because while it does humanize the physicist at the Los Alamos factory of the Manhattan Project, who was credited with helping to create the atomic bomb, Robert Oppenheimer, who later regretted the role he made in creating the atomic bomb and campaigned against nuclear proliferation. And he ironically even became a victim later on of the U.S.
Yep. You know, this is further proof of what we say. You know, these guys, these scientists, these Smiths, all right, this was put into their head by the Most High. This knowledge was given to them to do this, you know. But of course they think, you know, the humanists that they are, that, oh, this is all because I'm so smart, you know, blah, 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 blah. No, no. Again, prophecy has and or will be fulfilled. All right.
U.S. government's McCarthyism. But at the same time, the film has been criticized because people say that it whitewashes the brutality of the U.S. killing 200,000 Japanese civilians in these atomic bombings. The film doesn't show the nuking of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'm not going to be talking about the film today, but I think it's important to look at the real historical documents to understand the historical record.
Before we go too far, let me get that, because him, Fermi out of Chicago, and a whole host of others that collaborated on that project, they were just tools. At the end of the day, they were just tools of the Most High. This is Isaiah 54:16. Behold, I have created the smith that bloweth the coals in the fire, and that bringeth forth an instrument for his work. For his work. All right, and I have created the waster to destroy. All right. So you'll understand what I mentioned. They are smiths, so what I was talking about. All right.
So you can better understand these films that are made in 2023, nearly 80 years later, and be historically informed. In 1963, former President Eisenhower published a memoir titled Mandate for Change. And in this book, he recalls an incident in 1945 when the U.S. Secretary of War, Stimson, and of course, that was what the Secretary of Defense would be known as today, before the Pentagon changed its name from the Department of War to the Department of Defense.
Yeah, okay.
So the U.S. commander of the Secretary of the Military visited Eisenhower's headquarters in Germany.
But at the end of the day, why did they change it? Because that's actually what they do. Oh man, the more you learn, it's like, it's a beautiful thing, but you know, hey, let's get another scripture. Oh man, boy, they tell on themselves. Let's see. This is Psalm 55:21. Words of his mouth were smoother. Well, actually, I would start at 20. He hath put forth his hands against such as be at peace with him. He hath broken his covenant. The words of his mouth were smoother than butter, but war is in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet were they drawn swords. Again, war was in his heart. That's all this devil knows, is violence.
Germany, and let's not forget that Eisenhower was overseeing the U.S. military operations in Germany at the time, and he informed Eisenhower, Stimson, that the U.S. government was preparing to drop an atomic bomb on Japan. And Eisenhower wrote, he said, quote, "I was one of those who felt that there were a number of cogent reasons to question the wisdom of such an act." So Eisenhower did not think it was a good idea, and he told the Secretary of War, who apparently assumed that he was going to expect that Eisenhower would support the decision.
Are you seeing what I'm seeing in the middle here? Let me read. It says, during his recitation of the relevant facts, I had been conscious of a feeling of depression, and so I voiced to him my grave misgivings, first on the basis of my belief that Japan was already defeated and that dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary, and secondly because I thought that our country should avoid shocking world opinion by the use of a weapon whose employment was, I thought, no longer mandatory as a measure to save American lives. Speaks for itself.
Eisenhower said no, and here's what he wrote in his memoir. He said, "During his recitation of the relevant facts, I had been conscious of a feeling of depression, and so I voiced to him my grave misgivings, first on the basis of my belief that Japan was already defeated and that dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary." I want to repeat, former U.S. President Eisenhower, a top commander of the U.S. military, wrote in his memoir that it was completely unnecessary to drop the nuclear bombs on Japan. But I'm going to go back and continue here. Eisenhower added, secondly, I thought that our country should avoid shocking world opinion by the use of a weapon whose employment was, I thought, no longer mandatory as a measure to save American lives. It was my belief that Japan was, at that very moment, seeking some way to surrender with a minimum loss of face. And the Secretary of War, Stimson, was deeply perturbed by Eisenhower's attitude, angrily refuting the reason I gave for my quick conclusions. That's what Eisenhower wrote in 1963. Now, Eisenhower's opinion was also reflected in the 1946 Strategic Bombing Survey published by the U.S. military that came to the exact same conclusion. I'm going to look at that document in a minute here. I want to briefly look at another very interesting historical document that is not very well known, and all of this research...
Of course, that was, initially in 63, after, his memoirs, 18 years after the fact, and then the 1946 one, I don't know what month that was, but anywhere up to a year, again, after the fact. So, the fact remains that they knew, and maybe he'll get into this, but they knew, I believe, in February of 45. So you're looking at 7 months at least before the dropping. No, 6 months, I'm sorry, 6 months before the dropping of the bomb. So,
research I should give credit to Gumby for. This is a Twitter researcher who does a lot of very important work on the CIA and the U.S. national security state. And he found this reporting from the U.S. journalist Edgar Snow in a book that he published in 1958. And he recalls a visit that Eisenhower, as a top U.S. general, took to the Soviet Union in August 1945. This is the same month when the Truman administration dropped the nuclear bombs on Japan. And it shows that there were many people, even in the U.S. military, who did not want the war, the Cold War, on the Soviet Union. Of course, at least on paper at this moment, the USSR was a U.S. ally. It was part of the Allied powers fighting against fascism, fighting against Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and fascist Japan.
People forget that.
In this book, Eisenhower says that before the atom bomb was used on Japan, I would have said yes. I was sure we could keep the peace with Russia. Now I don't know. So this reflects the fact that Eisenhower didn't want to wage a war with the Soviet Union, and that the Cold Warriors in the U.S. government, who helped oversee the creation of the Cold War and oversee the bombing, the nuclear bombing of Japan.
Question. How many other allies, I guess, well, I'm just going to phrase it like this. How many allies of the United States know this history? My reason for asking this is, with what we know the statue in the book of Daniel where you got the head of gold, and then you get, as it goes down, the materials and value decrease, but when it gets down to the 10 toes, with these strained relations amongst the allies now, and again, this is prophesied to happen. How many do you think are aware of this? All right. So this is what you do to your ally, because Russia was an ally. Remember, there's that famous picture of Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin seated, all right, at that conference, all right. And then you turn around, you make them, the bad guy, so to speak. But again, this was set up. All right, this was set up. Again, prophecy must be fulfilled.
And they saw the atom bombing of Japan as a political act aimed at the Soviet Union. And Eisenhower actually said in this 1945 meeting in the Soviet Union, quote, "Until now, I would have said that we three, Britain with her mighty, that is, naval fleet, America with the strongest air force, and Russia, the Soviet Union, with the longest land force on the continent, we three could have guaranteed the peace of the world for a long, long time to come. But now I don't know. People are frightened and disturbed all over. Everyone feels insecure again." And that was, of course, because of the Cold War, which immediately began right at the end of World War II, before World War II even ended. And what I'm going to show in the rest of this video today is a clip from another video that I did back in July 2022 after the killing of Shinzo Abe, the former far-right leader of Japan. And in that video, which was over an hour long, I talked about the history of the Japanese fascists who were allied with Nazi Germany, and how the United States, the CIA specifically, rehabilitated many of those Japanese war criminals from the fascist Japanese Empire, freeing them from prison and helping them to create the right-wing political party that has basically controlled Japanese politics since The 19th.
Remember, I read Psalms 55:21 about war being in his heart. This is all this motherfucker knows. All right, he's got to start shit. He can't. Let me see if I can remember another scripture. If I can remember where to find it. Let's see. He can't help himself. Let's see. Proverbs 16. Hold on. Let's see. Hold on just a second. Just a second. Hold on. Let's see. Let's see. I can't remember how it was phrased now. God dug it. Maybe it'll come back to me. Let's continue with the video because it's got a little ways to go here.
1950s, which is the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, which is actually a very right-wing party despite its name. And the reality is that this party is very closely linked to fascism.
Now I got it. These damn devils. I went way too far. Hold on. Let's see. I had it inverted. This is Proverbs 4:16. For they sleep not except they have done mischief, and their sleep is taken away unless they cause some to fall. So here they are. They got their diplomats and their other agents out here spreading mischief. This is what's going on in Africa now. They're tired of the French, and there's a long history. It'll probably be my next video, as a matter of fact. A long history of the colonization there. And these countries are saying, no, we want you to fuck out of our country. And now France is playing this game like they want to trick those jakes into, because a lot of them are jakes, into causing some kind of incident so they can say, well, we were defending ourselves. All right. But this is what this devil does around the world. Continuing on.
So I did a very long video about that, and I'll link it in the description below. But toward the end of the video, I reviewed the historical evidence showing that the U.S. government admitted that it was not necessary to nuke Japan. So I'm going to conclude this video here just showing the rest of that clip. Only the United States. It is the only country in history that has used nuclear weapons not once but twice on a civilian population. Now, how many people died in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? A low estimate of 100,000. A more accurate estimate is probably 200,000 people, civilians, massacred, slaughtered by the U.S. so-called democracy. Now, this isn't in any way to downplay the horrific atrocities carried out by the fascist Japanese Empire. So let me start here with a little-known document, which is very important historically. This is the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. You can find this at the Harry Truman Library and Museum. This is part of trumanlibrary.gov. This is part of the U.S. government's National Archives. This is the text from the U.S. Department of War's Strategic Bombing Survey. They say here, quote, "It seems clear that even without the atomic bombing attacks, air supremacy over Japan could have exerted sufficient pressure."
Real quick, and I'll come back to what he's talking about here, but you notice, I'm not going to let that slide. You notice he said, well, that's not to take away from what Japan did. Nobody's arguing that fact. This is a tactic this devil uses, all right, to try to cover up what he did. What does that have anything to do with? You did, all right? As it was stated, they had already were looking for ways to surrender. They were just trying to save face. That's their custom, all right? But see, that goes into the history of this damn devil. And he'll try to make that argument, what he did with the so-called Native Americans, the tribes of Gad and Reuben here in North America, all right? Well, you know, they were always at war with each other. Again, that was them. What does that have to do with you? They did not treat you in a hostile way when you come over here. History, at least, he told the truth with that, all right? But what did you do? All right, and this is his kind of his tactic of trying to, you know, get out of shit, you know, worm his way out of shit. No, that ain't gonna work. Continuing on.
Pressure to bring about unconditional surrender and obviate the need for invasion. So once again, that's them acknowledging the nuclear bombing was not necessary. Here they say it as clear as day. Again, this is the mouth of the U.S. government. Quote, "Based on a detailed investigation of all of the facts and supported by the testimony of the surviving Japanese leaders involved, it is the U.S. government survey's opinion that certainly prior to December 31st of 1945, and in all probability prior to November 1st of 1945, here is the exact words of the U.S. government, quote, "Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, even if Russia, that is the Soviet Union, had not entered the war, and even if no invasion had been planned or contemplated." Let me repeat that. Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped. This is the mouth of the U.S. government admitting liquidating, massacring 200,000 Japanese civilians
At least.
was not necessary to end the war.
What about the radiation
Japan was on
effects?
the verge of surrendering anyway. And why did it do that? Why did the U.S. government massacre 200,000 civilians? Like I said, it was a sign to the Soviet Union. It was the first act of the First Cold War. It was the United States telling the Soviet Union, Japan is going to be our colony. We are going to control Japan. Socialism is not going to take root in Japan. Japan is not going to be a Soviet ally. If you don't believe me, here once again here are words from the mouth of the U.S. government. This is the Manhattan Project archive created by the U.S. Department of Energy at osti.gov. Harry Truman, when he received the word of the success of the Trinity test of nuclear weapons, his need for the help of the Soviet Union in the war against Japan was greatly diminished. Truman and his advisors were now not sure if they wanted Soviet help. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had promised to join the war against Japan by August 15, 1945. But Truman and his advisors were not sure they wanted the Soviet Union to help. If they used the atomic bomb, and that made victory possible without a Soviet invasion, then accepting Soviet help would only invite them, the Soviets, into the discussions regarding the post-war fate of Japan. Other historians argue that Japan would have surrendered even without the use of the atomic bomb, and that in fact Truman and his advisors used the bomb only in an effort to intimidate the Soviet Union. This is the U.S. Department of Energy admitting that this was assigned to intimidate the Soviet Union. This was the first act of the Cold War, the first Cold War. And here, once again, the U.S. government admits, quote, Truman hoped to avoid having to share the administration of Japan with the Soviet Union. Here is history.com, which...
See, all that propaganda is bullshit we were taught in school. It was just that. Propaganda is bullshit. Lies. Man.
They admit it too. This article from 2022 is titled, "The Hiroshima bombing did not just end World War II, it kick-started the Cold War. The colossal power of the atomic bomb drove the world's two leading superpowers into a new confrontation." Here's another article in a mainstream outlet. This is as mainstream as it gets in Washington. Foreign Policy magazine. Very mainstream. They say, the bomb didn't defeat Japan, Stalin did. It was not the nuclear bombing that the U.S. carried out that defeated Japan. It was the Soviet Union that defeated Japan. The U.S. dropped nuclear bombs on Japan in order to prevent the Soviet Union from having influence in Japan and preventing Japan from going socialist. The U.S. massacred 200,000 Japanese civilians in order to protect capitalism. This is a mainstream historian, Ward Wilson, writing in the mainstream Washington establishment magazine, Foreign Policy. Although the bombs did force an immediate end to the war, Japan's leaders had wanted to surrender anyway and likely would have done so before the American invasion planned for November 1st. Their use was therefore unnecessary. So why did they do it if it was unnecessary? It was to prevent the Soviet Union from having influence in Japan. And this is a very long article. He goes into detail explaining the scale of the bombing and the brutal U.S. Air Force bombing of Japan. 68 cities in Japan were attacked, and all of them were either partially or completely destroyed. Over 80% of the buildings in Japan were destroyed. 1.7 million Japanese people, these are civilians we're talking about, were made homeless. 300,000 Japanese civilians were killed. 750,000 Japanese civilians were wounded. 66 of these air raids carried out by the U.S. Army Air Force were carried out with conventional bombs, 2 with atomic bombs. So, brutal U.S. bombing. But obviously this isn't in any way to whitewash the horrific crimes committed by the Japanese fascists. As I spent an hour talking about, the U.S. government recruited those Japanese fascists. So, this scholar talks about why the U.S. nuclear bombing of Japan was not necessary to force Japan to have unconditional surrender. So, he says, if the Japanese were not concerned with city bombing in general, or the atomic bombing of Hiroshima in particular, what were they concerned with? The answer is simple: the Soviet Union. They were afraid of a Soviet all-out invasion of Japan. He writes that the question was not whether to continue, but how to bring the war to a close under the best terms possible. So the U.S. government wanted Japan to be its colony on the best terms possible. So he writes, one way to gauge whether it was the bombing of Hiroshima or the invasion and declaration of war by the Soviet Union that caused Japan's surrender is to compare the way in which these two events affected the strategic situation. After Hiroshima was bombed on August 6th, both options were still alive for Japan. Bombing Hiroshima did not foreclose either of Japan's strategic options. The impact of the Soviet declaration of war and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria was quite different, however. Once the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, Stalin could no longer act as mediator. He was now a belligerent, so the diplomatic option for Japan was wiped out by the Soviet move. The effect on the military situation was equally dramatic. When the Russians invaded Manchuria, they sliced through what had once been an elite army, and many Russian units only stopped when they ran out of gas. The Soviet Soviet invasion invalidated the Japanese military's decisive battle strategy, just as it invalidated the Japanese diplomatic strategy. At a single stroke, the Soviet Union evaporated all of Japan's options. The Soviet invasion was strategically decisive. It foreclosed both of Japan's options, that is, the military option and the diplomatic option, while the bombing of Hiroshima was not decisive. It did not foreclose either of Japan's options of military solution or diplomacy. And he writes, again, this is Foreign Policy magazine, as mainstream as it gets. Attributing the end of the war to the atomic bomb served Japan's interest in multiple ways, but it also served U.S. interests. If the atomic bomb won the war, then the perception of U.S. military power would be enhanced. U.S. diplomatic influence in Asia and around the world would increase. So this is part of the narrative of the U.S. empire. The narrative is the U.S. ended World War II with the nuclear bombs, which were supposedly necessary, even though the U.S. government internally admitted that the atomic bombing was actually not necessary. And that helped strengthen the U.S. empire around the world, and especially in Asia, and it prevented Japan from going socialist, and it prevented Japan from becoming an ally of the Soviet Union.
And there you have it. In a nutshell, well, more than a nutshell here at this point. All right. And yet, they know these things. There's documents to prove it. But the American idiots, well, yeah, you know, we had to drop the bombs, but, you know, I guess it makes them feel better. Which, you notice a pattern here. All right. Things make them folks feel better about themselves for who they truly are. That goes to CRT, as they call it. But when you actually take the time to research, all right, hey, you'll find out the truth. This whole thing is built on lies that they tell to the stupid citizens. All right, they want to claim that CRT is, what's the word they use? Indoctrinating our children. Well, what is this shit? All right, that you taught people in school. Well, we had to use the atomic bombs to end the war early because, well, you know how fanatical the Japanese were, you know, the soldiers and blah, 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 blah. Bullshit. There was an ulterior motive, and he's telling you what those motives were. There's a little bit more.
And I should say that the leaders of the resistance against Nazism in Europe, the leaders of the resistance against Italian fascism in Europe, were the communists. And similarly, in Japan, the leaders of the anti-fascist resistance were socialists, unified by the Japan Socialist Party. If the U.S. had not turned Japan into a colony, if it had not militarily occupied Japan from 1945 until 1952, and then created a right-wing puppet regime, which has controlled Japan since 1955 in a one-party right-wing regime dominated by the LDP party, the Liberal Democratic Party, the right-wing party of Shinzo Abe and his grandfather, the fascist war criminal. If the U.S. had not done all of that, the most likely historical scenario is that Japan would have gone socialist. That is what is likely would have happened. That's likely is what would have happened.
Are you justifying?
Japan would have gone socialist. It would have become an ally of the Soviet Union, and then it would have become an ally of the People's Republic of China when the communists took over in 1949. So you would have the Soviet Union, Japan, and China as three massive communist superpowers. That is why
as usual, a snake is going to eventually reveal itself. Thank you for the information, but no, you're not going to turn this into a, well, if we hadn't have done it, just like I just said. All right, you see, let them talk long enough. All right, but again, this is all set up in the spirit. All right, like I said, prophecy must be fulfilled. And if you go further back in history, Japan itself was almost wiped out by, guess who? The Khans. All right, as in Genghis and his grandson Kublai Khan. All right, he's going to wipe it out. And as a result, that's why you get the term kamikaze, the divine winds, because that's what's happened. All right. The army is at the bottom of the ocean. Anyway, so I'm going to stop it right there. There's only like, a minute and a half left. But once he started talking like that, I'm going to end it. So here we have, that's why I read those two scriptures at the beginning, Ecclesiastes 12:14 and Luke 12:2. All this is coming out. All right. All this information. All right. That proves these motherfuckers were liars and they're nothing but murderers at the end of the day. That's how Esau wrote. So I hope, once again, that you were edified. Once again, I always like to state that's what we do here at Great Millstone. This is a good lesson in that it's good to, especially when it pertains to the scriptures, you got to understand there's history behind these things. All right. Can't just sit in church, amen, amen, and not knowing what you're amen about. All right. You have to research these things for yourself, just like secular history here. All right. You have to learn to meld the two. All right. And then that will help you understand the mystery. All right. So with that, hey, until the next video, shalom.